On September 12th, 2012, police responded to an emergency call from a local gym in Austin, Texas. Inside, they discovered the body of a 19-year-old gym instructor, Luke Marshall. What initially seemed like a tragic accident soon unraveled into a shocking web of lies, betrayal, and secret affairs involving 3 older women from his neighborhood. By the time the police pieced together the events, it was too late. Luke was dead, and the truth behind his illicit affairs came to light. Luke Marshall, a 19-year-old gym instructor, had always felt a strong attraction to older women. He didn't understand it at first, but as he started his new job at the gym in early 2012, everything began to make sense. The older women who attended the gym were always kind to him, offering compliments and lingering during conversations. It didn't take long for Luke to realize they were lonely, and they appreciated his attention. He, in turn, felt a deep thrill whenever he noticed their interest in him. By the middle of March, Luke had grown closer to 3 of his neighbors, Helen, Barbara, and Margaret. Helen, at 65, lived in a retirement community nearby. She often came to the gym to stay active after the death of her husband. Her loneliness was apparent, and Luke noticed how her eyes lit up when he paid attention to her. She was cautious at first, unsure about Luke's intentions, but by late March, she began meeting him outside of the gym. They started seeing each other at local motels, where their relationship quickly turned physical. Barbara, aged 67, was a widow who had lived alone for several years. Unlike Helen, Barbara was bolder, more daring. She made it known that she found Luke attractive, and it wasn't long before Luke responded to her advances. By the end of March 2012, Barbara and Luke had also started an affair. They would meet in different places, including Barbara's home when her family wasn't around. The intensity of their relationship grew quickly, with Barbara constantly showering Luke with gifts, trying to keep his attention focused on her. Margaret, 62, was more reserved than the other 2 women. Recently divorced, she had begun coming to the gym to rebuild her life. She found comfort in Luke's charm, and over time, their casual gym conversations turned into secret meetings. Margaret was unsure at first, but by May, she couldn't resist Luke any longer. They began an affair, though it remained more discreet than the others. Luke's relationships with Helen, Barbara, and Margaret were kept strictly hidden from each other. Each woman believed she was the only one in Luke's life. None of them had any idea that Luke was involved with 2 other women from the same neighborhood. This secret life gave Luke a sense of power, as he realized how much these women depended on his attention. They were willing to do anything to keep him close, making him feel desired and in control. Their meetings were frequent and became more adventurous as time went on. Luke enjoyed the thrill of sneaking around, meeting Helen late at night in motels or at her quiet home, while Barbara was more aggressive, preferring their encounters to take place at her house during the day. Margaret, on the other hand, was cautious, but as time went on, her need for Luke's affection grew, and their meetings became more intimate. By June 2012, the relationships had grown deeper and more complex. Helen, who had initially been hesitant, found herself consumed by thoughts of Luke. She thought of him constantly, even considering the possibility of moving closer to him to spend more time together. She imagined how her life would change with Luke in it, even though she kept their relationship a secret from everyone around her. She was deeply emotionally attached to him, convinced that their connection was special and different. Barbara, however, was more aggressive in her pursuit of Luke. Her possessive nature became more apparent by June. She often grew jealous if Luke missed a scheduled meeting with her, and she was always seeking ways to keep his attention on her. Barbara had begun gifting Luke expensive items, from watches to gym equipment, hoping to ensure that he remained interested in her. Despite knowing that Luke had other gym clients to attend to, Barbara believed their relationship was exclusive and that Luke cared for her in the same way. Meanwhile, Margaret, the quietest of the three, was slowly developing a deeper emotional dependence on Luke. Recently divorced, she found solace in his presence, and her life revolved around their secret meetings. She tried to remain cautious, not wanting to become too involved too quickly. But by July 2012, she was falling for Luke, believing he was genuinely interested in her well-being. Margaret preferred to meet Luke in more discreet places, like quiet parks or at his apartment late at night. She cherished the time they spent together, even if it was fleeting. For Luke, managing the relationships became a thrilling game. He enjoyed the attention, but the growing emotional dependency of the three women started to add complications. Each woman wanted more time with him, more of his affection, and more of his attention. They were all drawn to his youthful charm, and Luke was careful not to let any of them discover his other affairs. As July came to a close, the tension between the women unknowingly escalated. Luke continued juggling his secret life, meeting Helen in the evenings at her retirement home, Barbara during the day at her home, and Margaret on quiet nights in hidden locations. He reveled in the power he held, thinking he could keep his affairs hidden forever, unaware that the situation was slowly spiraling out of control. None of the women suspected anything yet, but the growing possessiveness of Barbara and the deepening attachment of Helen and Margaret were like a ticking time bomb. Luke believed he had control over the situation, not realizing that the truth was beginning to unravel and the consequences of his actions were just around the corner. By the end of July, all three women were unknowingly competing for Luke's time and attention, and it was only a matter of time before their worlds collided. In August 2012, the delicate balance Luke had maintained with his three affairs began to unravel. It started with an unexpected encounter on the night of August 15th, when Helen decided to visit the gym after hours. She had been feeling uneasy for weeks, sensing something was off with Luke. He had grown distant, canceling their usual meetings and acting more distracted when they were together. Helen, looking for reassurance, went to see him unannounced. As she approached the gym, Helen noticed that the lights were still on, even though it was well past closing time. Curious, she entered the building quietly, expecting to surprise Luke. Instead, what she saw shocked her. Luke was not alone. He was with Barbara, and the sight of them together, so intimate and familiar, made her heart race. Helen stood frozen, watching as everything she thought she knew about her relationship with Luke crumbled before her eyes. Unable to contain her anger, Helen stormed out of the gym, determined to confront Luke the next day. She felt betrayed and humiliated, realizing that she had been nothing more than another conquest for him. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. She had fallen for Luke, thinking their connection was special, but now it was clear that she had been one of many. The betrayal stung deeply, And as she walked home that night, her thoughts grew darker. The next day, on August 16th, Helen confronted Luke at her home. Her anger was palpable, and she demanded an explanation. Luke, caught off guard by her rage, knew there was no point in hiding the truth any longer. He coldly admitted to Helen that he had been using her, along with Barbara and Margaret, for his own pleasure. He revealed that he found older women exciting and that the affairs were purely physical for him, nothing more. Luke spoke without any remorse, making it clear that their relationship meant nothing to him beyond satisfying his fantasies. Helen was devastated. The realization that she had been manipulated and used so carelessly broke her. She had believed their connection was real, that Luke cared for her. But now she saw that it had all been a lie. Her heartbreak quickly turned to fury as she stormed out of her home, swearing that she would not let this betrayal go unpunished. Over the next few days, Helen's anger festered. She couldn't stop thinking about what Luke had done to her and the other women. She knew Barbara had been involved, but she suspected that Margaret, too, was part of the deceit. Meanwhile, Barbara began to sense that something was wrong. Luke's behavior had changed, and she noticed that he was becoming more distant with her as well. She started to piece together the possibility that Luke might be seeing other women, though she wasn't entirely sure who. The seeds of doubt were planted, and her possessiveness grew even stronger as she felt the threat of losing Luke. By September, the tension between Luke and Helen had reached a breaking point. On September 12, 2012, Helen decided it was time to confront Luke once again, this time in a more private setting where she could demand answers. She knew he often stayed late at the gym to clean up after closing, so she waited until after dark and headed there, determined to make him pay for what he had done to her. When Helen arrived at the gym around 9:00 p.m., she found Luke alone, cleaning up the equipment. The gym was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the room, and the atmosphere was tense. Helen walked in without a word, but the look on her face made it clear that she was not there to reconcile. She immediately began accusing Luke of using her, Barbara, and Margaret, her voice filled with anger and betrayal. Luke, as cold and indifferent as ever, dismissed her accusations, showing no sign of remorse for what he had done. The argument escalated quickly. Helen, now consumed by rage, could no longer hold back her emotions. She felt humiliated, used, and betrayed, and as she stood there, watching Luke's calm demeanor, something inside her snapped. Her vision blurred with fury as she looked around the gym for something, anything, to release her anger. That's when her eyes landed on a heavy dumbbell resting on the floor nearby. Without thinking, Helen grabbed the dumbbell, her hands shaking with rage. In one swift motion, she swung it at Luke's head. The sound of the impact echoed through the empty gym, and Luke collapsed instantly, the weight of his body crumpling to the floor. Helen stood frozen for a moment, staring down at Luke's lifeless body, unable to comprehend what she had just done. It was too late. Luke was dead. The dumbbell had killed him instantly, leaving Helen in a state of shock. She dropped the dumbbell beside his body, her heart racing as the reality of the situation began to sink in. For a moment, she thought about running, but before she could move, the door to the gym creaked open. Margaret had arrived, completely unaware of what had just transpired. She had come to see Luke, as she often did late at night. But what she saw when she entered the gym, left her speechless. Luke's body lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath him, while Helen stood frozen, staring at the scene. Margaret panicked, her mind unable to process what had happened. Without a word, she turned and fled from the gym, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallway as she ran out into the night. Helen, now alone with Luke's body, knew she had to act quickly. She grabbed her phone and called Barbara, explaining in a hushed, frantic voice what had happened. Barbara, understanding the gravity of the situation, rushed over to the gym. When she arrived, the two women quickly devised a plan. They decided to blame Margaret for Luke's death, knowing she had been there shortly after the incident. Together, Helen and Barbara hid the dumbbell, wiping down any evidence that could link them to the crime. They then made sure to stage the scene in a way that would make it look like Margaret had attacked Luke. By the time they finished, the gym was eerily quiet again, and the two women left, leaving Luke's body behind, and the truth buried for now. On the morning of September 13, 2012, the Austin Police Department received a call reporting the death of Luke Marshall, a 19-year-old gym instructor who had been found lifeless inside the gym where he worked. Initially, the scene seemed like a tragic accident. Luke had sustained a head injury, and with the weights and gym equipment scattered around, the assumption was that he may have accidentally hurt himself. The investigators treated the case as a possible accident, but something didn't sit right with the officers on the scene. As the day unfolded, the investigators began to question those close to Luke, including his three neighbors, Helen, Barbara, and Margaret. Helen and Barbara were cooperative, though they both pointed fingers at Margaret. They claimed that Margaret had been acting strangely in recent weeks, and suggested that she had grown increasingly erratic. Both women stated that Margaret had been the last person to be seen with Luke on the night of his death, which raised suspicions. The detectives, now considering the possibility of foul play, shifted their focus to Margaret. Margaret, still shaken from discovering Luke's body, was immediately brought in for questioning. Her panic and confusion only made the situation worse, as her inability to explain why she had been at the gym that night cast doubt on her innocence. At first glance, her behavior seemed suspicious, and investigators were beginning to consider her a prime suspect. However, as the investigation progressed, a new piece of the puzzle emerged. The gym cleaner, who had been at the gym the night of the incident, came forward with a shocking revelation. He had been in the restroom at the time of Luke's death and had overheard the entire confrontation between Helen and Luke. The cleaner remained hidden, afraid of being caught up in the situation, but what he had heard was undeniable. He provided investigators with a detailed account of Helen's angry accusations and the violent sound that followed. On top of this, security footage from a nearby camera revealed crucial evidence. The footage showed Helen entering the gym late in the evening on September 12th, before Luke's death, and Margaret fleeing the scene shortly after the incident. However, there was no footage that placed Margaret near Luke during the time of the attack. This evidence began to shift the focus away from Margaret, as the timeline didn't match up with her being the perpetrator. Investigators pieced together the events, and the cleaner's testimony combined with the footage painted a clearer picture of what had really happened. Forensic evidence further sealed the case. Investigators discovered traces of blood on Helen's clothing that matched Luke's, and they found the dumbbell that had been used as the murder weapon, which had been poorly hidden by Helen and Barbara in a gym storage closet. The evidence pointed toward a cover-up orchestrated by the two women who had conspired to pin the crime on Margaret. On October 15, 2012, Helen Carter and Barbara Martin were arrested for Luke's murder. Both women were charged with murder and conspiracy to cover up the crime. The police confronted them with the overwhelming evidence, including the cleaner's testimony, the security footage, and the forensic findings. Margaret, although still traumatized by the events, was officially cleared of all charges. She had been at the wrong place at the wrong time, but the truth had finally come to light. The trial of Helen Carter and Barbara Martin began on November 10, 2012, in the Austin District Court. The case garnered significant media attention due to the shocking nature of the crime and the fact that two elderly women were at the center of a murder trial. The courtroom was packed as the prosecution laid out their case, detailing the events leading up to Luke's death. The prosecution's strategy was to show that Helen, driven by rage after discovering Luke's betrayal, had murdered him in a fit of anger. They presented evidence of Helen's confrontation with Luke and the violent attack that followed. The security footage, forensic evidence, and the cleaner's testimony were key components of their case. The prosecution also accused Barbara of conspiring to help Helen cover up the murder and attempting to frame Margaret. The defense, on the other hand, tried to argue that Helen's actions were not premeditated. They claimed that the murder had been a crime of passion, brought on by intense emotional distress caused by Luke's betrayal. They attempted to paint Helen as a victim of manipulation by Luke, stating that she had been deeply hurt and humiliated by his callous behavior. The defense also sought to minimize Barbara's involvement, suggesting that she had been swept up in the chaos and acted out of fear rather than malicious intent. As the trial progressed, the prosecution continued to build a strong case against both women. Witnesses were called to testify about the relationship between Luke and the three women, with investigators explaining how Luke had been involved in multiple affairs. The cleaner's testimony, combined with the security footage, was particularly damning for Helen and Barbara. The jury watched the footage showing Helen entering the gym and Margaret fleeing the scene, and the cleaner's account confirmed the confrontation that led to Luke's death. On March 20th, 2013, after weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury returned with their verdict. Helen was convicted of second-degree murder. The jury believed that while the murder had not been premeditated, Helen's violent actions were unjustifiable. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Barbara was found guilty of conspiracy to cover up the crime. Her role in helping Helen hide the murder weapon and framing Margaret was undeniable, and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Margaret, although cleared of all wrongdoing, struggled to move past the events of that night. Her life had been forever changed, and though she was legally innocent, the scandal continued to haunt her. The neighborhood was left in shock as the sordid details of the affair and the murder came to light, shaking the quiet suburban community of Austin to its core. The trial of Helen Carter and Barbara Martin became a sensational story, drawing attention to the dangerous web of lies, betrayal, and murder that had unfolded in their seemingly peaceful lives. As the months passed, the community struggled to come to terms with the tragedy, while Helen and Barbara faced the consequences of their actions behind bars. The story of the young gym instructor's affair with 3 older women and the deadly consequences made headlines, shocking the quiet suburban community of Austin. The case served as a cautionary tale of deception, lust, and the deadly cost of betrayal. The tragic end of Luke Marshall and his affairs with 3 older women is just one of the many shocking stories we uncover. If you want more content like this, make sure to subscribe for daily updates. And don't forget to check out our next video about the housewives whose affair with teenage neighbor's son ends deadly.